Okay, between the last talk and this talk, there's some differences, but there are also some similarities. The differences are perhaps that while the last talk was longer than the first one that he gave, mine is definitely shorter. The similarities are that now, instead of doing a technical talk, because I think that although I tried to describe motivation and things a lot in the previous one, there was a lot of technical material, this one is really about intentions. It's about things to think about and motivations, that sort of thing. So it's kind of metaphysical in a way. Also, it's interesting that I have this opportunity. This is my opportunity to debate a side of the sort of singularity and humanity plus environment that is not represented much here. Because there's really no one here who's been speaking about life extension as, you know, one of the goals that's part of this future development in terms of, say, biological life extension, for example. So we know Aubrey de Grey as one of the main proponents of that. So they're not here to defend themselves, and I'm going to attack them anyway. Biological life extension is not enough, is what I'm saying. So first I'm going to look at this from a personal perspective. And by personal, I don't necessarily mean just my perspective. I mean the perspective of an individual person. So the first thing I want to say is nobody just wants to live longer. It's never about that. So when we think, yeah, I just want a longer life, even if all you want to do is sit there and enjoy the sunshine, that's a motivation. It's not because you want to live longer, it's because you want to live longer and sit in the sunshine. So generally speaking, or even explicitly speaking, there is some kind of motivation behind it. But depending on what your motivation is, so what is the goal? What are you trying to achieve by being part of this experience for a longer period of time? It informs what perhaps is the method that you'd like to seek out. And when we're trying to compare different ways for an individual or a species or some agent, if we want to call it that, to exist for a long period of time, and we look at biological methods, for instance, and we look at uploading, which has been a major topic here, then there are definitely some major distinctions between the reasons why you would pick one or the other. And I mean, one that comes to mind pretty quickly when you think about biological life extension is, well, this is what we know. It's the way we live right now. So if you live another 10 years beyond what you normally would, it doesn't change very much about any of the assumptions you have to make. So it seems pretty obvious that that would be okay. I mean, we've already extended our lives quite a bit. So why not go a little further, and maybe even further than that, another 100 years, another 200 years. Right, so what are the motivations here? Okay, I'm going to say something about motivations because if you know what you're trying to achieve, if you know the objective or goal that you're heading towards, that means that you have some idea of when you would call it a success, when you would say that yes, we've achieved this, we've done this, the procedure was the right one, the future we've chosen is the right one, the technology is the right one, or not. And yeah, so for me personally, the interest that I had in this began a long time ago. I think I was maybe 13 years old, when what I bumped into was just the fact that I was interested in doing a lot of things. I enjoyed writing, and I enjoyed making music, and I enjoyed reading, and I enjoyed exploring, and I thought all of these things should be done, and so many more. And I ran into two problems. One of them is there's never enough time. And the other one, obviously, is that some things we simply can't do. So, for example, trying to discover what it feels like to jump into a volcano isn't something that you can easily do and then talk about it afterwards. So, yeah, this is kind of what set the whole course. Wanting to basically be able to create more, create anything that you could, and understand everything, or get towards understanding everything, understanding more and more all the time. Those are really important goals to me. And I think a lot of people have fairly similar goals. I've asked around a lot because I always think it's important to ask about the actual underlying motivations, especially when you start working with someone. So for example, in my previous career, when I worked at Halcyon Molecular, we had some people there who were very interested in life extension. And they went about it in very many different ways. They didn't know exactly which procedure they wanted to use. And I wanted to understand how they were picking these things. So I asked them, well, what is it that you actually want? And then you get answers such as, well, one of the founders said what he really wanted to do was he wanted to go to space. That's what his original idea was. He wanted to go out to space and explore things. And because of that, he started thinking about how you would do this, and that the distances were large, and you couldn't easily span that distance because you would die before you get there. And so he had to think about life extension, and ultimately he figured out that, well, uploading seems to be the most convenient way to do that, so he got interested in that. But that's what ends up happening. When you really ask deep down, you find that there's quite a core of people who have fairly similar ideas, whether it's about exploration, understanding, it all sounds kind of similar. Now, if you're creating incredible machines, like the ones that Marcus was talking about just before, that's great because we don't have all the capabilities. I was just pointing that out. And these machines can do things we can't. We already have many machines that do things we can't do. But the question is, how much does that meet our original motivation for getting into it? How much does that meet our personal goals? For some of us, perhaps that's fine, because maybe we do not have a goal that involves experiencing something that we currently can't experience. Maybe it's really just about making a machine. But for quite a few of us, it is in fact about coming up with new experiences. And there are some that we already know matter. When you get a new experience, like when you first realize that you can not just listen to music on the radio, but you can actually play an instrument, or you can create music, there's an incredible experience that goes along with that. It's a true realization that there is something new out there. And similarly, even just I happen to be a kayaker. If you sit in a kayak and suddenly you feel like you don't have legs anymore, but this thing has become your legs and it just does exactly what you want, that's also an entirely different experience. So that's kind of what I'm getting at. Now imagine something completely different that we can't do right now. We can't perceive the background radiation of the universe. I took some random example there of something that we can use machines to detect. So experiences that are sensations, or experiences that have something to do with watching some process unfold over a long period of time that we couldn't do if our lives were longer, something of that nature can have a profound impact on whether we feel that we've actually achieved this goal, this success of what we think is really interesting to us. Okay, so I've got a big picture up here of Skynet, which those of you who know the Terminator series understand what that's about. It's this, the origins of the whole problem, basically. An automated military system that doesn't have any human intervention or human factors built into it. It just operates on its own. So one of the things that happens if you have a system like that is you might be entirely out of the loop. And is that desirable? Now, it's true that you would not think that that was a desirable thing. This is your default assumption. But when you start to optimize processes, sometimes you get there, even if you don't mean to, or you haven't thought about it that way. And this is actually an explicit plan, Skynet. There's a very real plan in the Air Force to automate pretty much everything about drone warfare and take even kill decisions out of the hand of humans. Now, I happened to have a discussion with someone from the intelligence agencies who thought that was a really bad idea, and this was the main reason he was interested in things like brain-computer interfaces and other ways of staying informed of what's going on in these machine systems that they're building up. So this is not just theory, this is something that might actually happen. Now, beyond that, on a personal realm, there are some near-term reasons why you would be interested in topics such as uploading or neural interfaces, or something that actually adapts and changes something about the nature of how you are and how your brain works, as opposed to simply biological life extension. And this is the problem that, as you get older, you acquire more information. You're learning. Your memory is adapting how your synapses work, and you have different patterns that you're attuned to. So as you're getting older, you become more used to seeing certain patterns and recognizing them immediately. This is turning you into a filter for those patterns. So it becomes harder to adopt new, novel patterns and to see them in a different way, to create different kinds of concepts. It's not a coincidence that we might say that people who've been around for a long time, say people who've been here for many, many decades, might have a certain view of the world that is somewhat different from people who are young, who were were just, maybe in their teens or something like that. Now you can imagine what happens when you extend this and people are becoming 100, 200, 300 years old, and they're a large mass of the population because they're not dying. So you have quite a lot of people there who are having trouble coming up with adjustments to new ideas, to new memes that are going around. So one of the things that really interests me is to try to do something about that, to try to be able at the same time to adopt entirely new views of what's going on and to be able to react quickly to things that you know and still use your knowledge well and wisely. This is one of the reasons why I think actually looking at what you can do to the mind, to the brain, to help make this possible is important even if you're interested in biological life extension. Now, social reasons to compare the two and to think about what we really want. So, something about genes. Gene survival, it says here, is extremely dependent on an environment. Okay, I kind of alluded to this yesterday. Gene survival is this process where, well, genes, they try to replicate and be successful in an environment. That's how selection picked which genes work, is because they happen to be ones that generate an environment for themselves that is very good at surviving right somewhere. That environment they generate is a type of animal or a type of plant or us. And when they work well in that environment, it survives and those genes survive. So the gene replicators are helping themselves move along. But it's not likely that they would survive very well when there are a lot of changes. But what's worse is that gene replication, this process that came along through natural selection, isn't actually directly addressing the things that were part of the motivation we talked about before, and maybe even for all of our society, for this whole system of civilization that we have. It doesn't really address the problem. How do you sustain that? Well, how do you sustain the things that we actually care about? And just to be very blunt about it, if you have that DNA code, how is that one any better than that one? We don't actually care, or at least I don't. I'm not going around looking at books full of DNA and trying to say, yeah, this is a great type of DNA. I'm going to dedicate my life towards making sure that these sequences appear a lot. I would perhaps if I knew that this was directly correlated to something else that I was interested in. So when it's just part of another bigger problem, yes, then I'm interested in DNA, but never just because of the DNA. I don't care about those sequences. And this is really what we are. We're vessels for this game of gene replication and natural selection in genes. But there's been something else that's been going on for the last 10,000 years, or maybe even longer, and that is that, well, natural selection ended up creating these things that have nervous systems. And at some point it created something that had a nervous system that was able to be creative, to think about art, to think about how they get along in a society and communicate. And those are us, of course. And those things became important in themselves. Now, of course, they still serve a purpose for the gene replication, for this survival of those codes there, because, that's how natural selection works, right, up to that point. But it's obvious that what we celebrate are the things that have something to do with that other stuff, with those cultural things, those personal things, the stuff that we seem to care about more. We care about new discoveries in science and great new technology and wonderful art and beautiful music. Those are things we care about more than that code. And that's the kind of thing we're really trying to protect if we want to go forward. So there are certain future societies and experiences that are more desirable than others. And what that means is that there are perspectives, or maybe even memes, that you would prefer to champion over others. And of course, all of us have slightly different ones. We share some, or there's some similarities, but generally you're the best champion of the particular view that you have, or the particular meme that you have. And you can try to pass this on by communicating with other persons. But there's a lot inside a mind. There are very many things in there, and it's hard to communicate everything you've got in there. And if there are a lot of things that really are relevant to what you would like to see happen in the future, or how you would like to see society develop, what you think is the right way forward, it can be hard to get it all out there quickly. As long as you're around, you're there to champion these ideas and these memes. And sometimes it's not about something big like changing politics. Sometimes it's just about you having your aesthetic impact on a certain area in art, for example. Something like that. And what happens, of course, is that death keeps stealing our champions, takes all the experts away. You get older, you learn more, you have much more experience, you've done your craft much longer, you're the best person at this in the world, and boom, you're gone. And, that's what happens. So for society, it's interesting to think what would happen if you didn't always lose these experts. Now there is, of course, the question of, yes, sure, even if things like whole brain emulation are a good thing for society in the long term, should we be looking at this right now? There's so many other things that are happening in the world. There are people starving, there's disease, there are environmental problems, so many things that we should dedicate resources to. We should do that now, and I don't disagree. I think that those are very valuable goals. It's not really a question of whether the one competes directly with the other, because we certainly also expend plenty of resources on stuff that has nothing to do with those urgent causes, entertainment or warfare, something like that. But even if it were something to consider, that there might be, funds taken out of research into some epidemic versus funds for brain research, you need to balance that carefully. But we don't like it when politicians are myopic, for instance. We constantly complain that political parties are only interested in the next election cycle. So they're only going to look at something that's important to them right now, that gets them some votes. They never really consider long-term future plans. They don't do that. So we're upset when they do that. So why should we act the same way they do? Why should we only look at the immediate problem, things that are going on right now, when there are these big problems that are going to be something that the entire species has to deal with eventually, that we could be doing something about right now? So let's not put it off, let's do something about it. Especially if it's not directly competing with those resources, and we can find resources among, cigarette advertisements or something. Okay, so now a species view, because I was just mentioning how this might matter to the species' future. There is a case to be made, and the case I'll make right now, that life extension through biological means, just making us grow older, and maybe staying healthy and looking like we're 20 the whole time, but growing older, could increase the fragility of the entire species. And this is because you're basically continuing to generate more people who are consuming the same resources. That's one of the problems. Or you'd have to cut back on births because you don't want there to be more people. And in that case, you have, again, this problem of fewer people with novel perspectives as opposed to persons with the exact same perspective, which makes you less flexible as a society, as a species, towards new challenges. Or if you decide that, well, we can have both, we can have all these people stay alive and we have plenty of births, we need to expand, we need to find new resources somewhere else, well, then you've got this problem that you're environmentally limited because it's biological life extension, meaning you're really only suited to live on Earth. The other environments are really not suitable. It's harder to live on Mars than it is to live in a desert here on Earth. There are way better resources in the worst environments here than in the best environments in our proximate galaxy or proximate solar system. But also, if you continue to improve how long we live in a biological way, if we do biological life extension within the same evolutionary niche, a way to look at this is to say that it's further specialization for the same kind of challenges, the same kind of performance. So if we look at this from a more technical point of view, you could say you're overtraining for that problem. You're overtraining for this particular problem of living here and now. And that's in conflict with generalization, with the ability to take on more, take on different things. So over the long term, this is something that can really come back and haunt you. And just to make my point from what is this? This is the fallacy of arguing by authority or something like that, which I'm not going to do. Aubrey de Grey, who is, of course, the big proponent of methods of continuing life extension biologically and then getting to a takeoff point where you actually become immortal by constantly reaching that next stage, is actually a strong proponent of uploading. He sees the biological life extension as just the first phase, as something that he considers easier to do right now. Give you another 10 years, eventually you're going to survive until something like moving into other substrates is possible. Now, there are some technical reasons as well why you might want to consider working on something like whole brain emulation instead of biological life extension. There are some arguments to be made that indeed, getting another 5 years, okay, perhaps that's easier than whole brain emulation. But actually, conquering death, the idea that you might get rid of all of the causes of human suffering, disease, decrepitude, dying, that's really, really difficult. It's much more difficult than people seem to think. There's kind of a popular idea that biological life extension is something we're going to achieve with some simple solution, maybe stem cells, or something like that. Just one thing, it's going to solve it all. Or that, by contrast, something like uploading is incredibly hard because, well, that's not, it's not biology. What are you doing? Where are you putting this thing? It's very different. And it's true, it is hard. It's certainly hard. But how do you compare two different, very difficult things? Well, let's look at something. For example, how many challenges are there? What I have here, on the one side, is a chart that was drawn up by John Ferber. He does this quite frequently. He keeps updating the chart. It is the System Biology of Human Aging. This one is the model network for 2011. And on the right, it's just a generic piece of imagery. It's supposed to indicate the complexity of the brain, and you have to get out of it. But we already discussed that yesterday. 100 billion neurons, trillions of synapses, and what are exactly the signals you're looking at? Very complicated problem. But there's a huge difference in the way that you would approach these two. You see on the left side here in this chart, the different problems that occur, those paths that lead to something that causes decrepitude, disease, death, etc., they're all really somewhat different. Each one of them requires a different discipline almost to investigate it. There's cancer. There's also Alzheimer's. They're not all the same. They don't all come from the same cause, and there are things way down to the cellular level and below. And they require different approaches. They require a lot of work for each one of those arrows. Different tools. On that side, we have a big problem because there are a lot of pieces in there, but the pieces are replicated over and over. We say there are 100 billion neurons, but they're all neurons. They all have a shape. If you have a device that can capture the morphology of 100 neurons, it can also capture the morphology of 1,000 or 1,000,000 neurons. So building the tools that carry out at a large scale isn't really a different problem in terms of what the problem is. It's just a matter of engineering. So yes, there's exploration as well. There are scientific problems. But there aren't quite as many different types of challenges as on this side. At least that's my contention. I could be proved wrong, but that's what I'm saying. So maybe this popular idea that the one on the right is harder than the one on the left, that's wrong. We should flip that around. So I think what I'm really trying to say is that the two things, while they sometimes pop up at the same conference, and here they didn't, are actually two very different objectives. Life extension and substrate independence are not the same thing, because what I was talking about, substrate independence, doesn't deal with just the problem of how do you stay alive longer. It deals with other issues. It deals with motivations that you have for trying to achieve things you currently can't achieve. It deals with things like, well, how do you make backups? Because even if you do biological life extension, that doesn't automatically give you a backup. And when you have valuable information, like a document you really care about, you don't want to keep it just on, I'm sorry, but that laptop that may have disappeared. You want to keep it on multiple places of storage so that you don't lose all your valuable stuff. So the same is really true when you have something that you care about, like the content of your mind. And and similarly, of course, there are all these other issues that I brought up for the society and the species, and just basically the ability for us to be part of this creating something interesting in the universe. Marcus brought up things like computronium, and we always imagine that eventually you can turn the universe into something more interesting than a decaying sort of universe that turns into more and more noise and background radiation. Maybe that's not what you want to do, but it's certainly something you can do. And this is exactly where those two differ. The one on the right tries to address those bigger goals and motivations, and the one on the left is more like medical care. Not that that's a bad thing, but maybe they shouldn't be lumped together in the same question when you put them in a conference, for example. Now there is a potential problem that I wanted to talk about as well, which I don't bring up very often. It's this idea of a catchment area, or there may be other words for it as well, but this is the word that my former co-founder of Carbon Copies, Suzanne Miller, came up with. It's this notion that perhaps the landscape that you've developed into, not just as a biological being, but even as a thinking being, is one with hills and valleys, where the tops of the hills are really the places where survival happens. It's where you're in a state of mind where you do things and carry out things that keep you alive, maybe even just because you feel you have a reason to live. Because there's no intrinsic reason why, for example, an artificial intelligence that hasn't got any predisposal to obey certain drives needs to have an inclination to do something that will keep it alive, or to do anything at all. We give it a purpose perhaps, or we develop some drives in there, or maybe there's some kind of random process that makes some drives pop up. But doing things, being alive, all of this, it's not something that you could just rationally deduce into, oh yes, that's what you have to do. It's more like, okay, because we were picked by natural selection, only the ones who had all the necessary predispositions and drives and desires that led them to do things that kept them alive are still here. That's why we're all survivors in a sense. But if you start to tweak that, and I'm not just talking about making AGI, but what if you start to tweak this by doing neural interfaces and attaching things to yourself? What if you start to tweak it by uploading yourself and changing something about how you perceive? Is it possible that even the insight you're gaining from that might basically make you nihilistic, or would somehow remove some important piece of this puzzle that keeps you from doing things that lead to your disappearance? So is it possible that maybe this landscape is really dangerous, that we're in a little catchment area where we all survive, but if you change things a lot, then you mostly drop into canyons? I don't know if it is. It might be that the landscape is quite safe. We don't really know. We haven't really explored this, and we haven't had a way to explore it. But what you do get if you're doing something like substrate-independent minds, or uploading, is that you can experiment. You can explore, because you can make little changes and you can also turn them back. It's not very often that we get that opportunity. When we try a drug by trying it out on a sample population, usually if it turns out that some of the population dies, you can't turn that back. Well, usually, never. So right now, a lot of clinical trials, a lot of what we experiment with ourselves involves a lot of risk. Now, I'm not saying that it doesn't involve any risk here, that it can't involve suffering, for example. But in principle, you have the ability to try something and to undo it. So there are some interesting things that you could look at here for protocols of experimentation when it comes to augmentation. So we haven't really talked about what it takes, neither in terms of ethics nor in terms of just the technical methods of doing it and what's involved in this kind of becoming more. But there's a way there where you can try out stuff, and you've got a backup, and you've got the ability to roll things back and to test little things here and there, turn it on, turn it off, see what does it look like this, what does it look like that, back and forth. So there are interesting things you can do then. I think that, yeah, so uploading is a big topic right now for me anyways, and it was also quite well represented here at this conference. It's big, it's complicated. It's not the only big and important thing that we can do as we move forward. Actually, I think it's only one step for a species that wants to be really advanced, a species that's going to take advantage of the fact that it's intelligent and can choose many different goals. There's so many interesting things we can do, but I do think that somewhere along the line, maybe it's too strong to say that it's necessary, but it seems like it's almost a necessity, because of the adaptation that it gives you, because of the fact that you can then try so many more things than you could now. So I sort of feel that if we encounter an alien species, for instance, that is really advanced, it's most likely that they are going to be substrate independent in some way. They're not going to come flying here in a big, big vessel that has a lot of dirt in it and grass and cows and stuff. They probably look quite different than that. And that's kind of what I wanted. Thank you.
So I'll leave to Adam to do some hands.
Yeah.
So kind of what you're saying is that we live in a world of game theory, and as soon as we win, we don't want to live anymore.
Maybe that's going a little far in I wasn't trying to say that. What I was trying to say is that yes, game theory, as in there are certain rules that we respect and that we want to carry out and therefore get ahead. There's a certain way of measuring whether you're getting ahead by those standards. If you start with some kind of a blank intelligent species that has no drives, then it's not clear why they would obey any kind of rules, why there would be any kind of game that they're trying to play. There isn't anything, so maybe they would just sit there. Maybe they would turn themselves off. Maybe they would do something random because a piece of cosmic radiation came along and flipped a bit somewhere and then something started happening. Who knows? Most likely, they would be starting off with whatever goals we set, because we don't generally create AI for no purpose. So the truth is that they would start, I don't know, probably becoming, a big paperclip replicator that just turns everything into paperclips or something like that. But the danger for us is that as we tweak something, we might be unsettling those rules and turning it into something where our rules that we're then playing by are no longer suited to the game we're in. It doesn't mean that we don't have any or something like that, or that we've won and then stopped doing something, because I'm not sure that that would be winning when you tweak it and then you're going off. It's more like everybody's racing around the circuit and you took a tangent out of the course. Yeah.
Would you experiment on your own upload?
Yes.
Well, look, I'm really interested in your to-do list. You've mentioned the volcano. Never be eaten by a shark or be a shark. Now, what you're saying, this is, I think, an odd for that landscape idea. You're saying your virtual worlds that you explore sort of look like ours, but very horrific and very interesting, and with a lot more sort of things going on. But what you're saying is that if you don't, once you've done it, of course, you're going to be changed by the experience.
Yeah.
And that could be leading you into a part of your landscape that's dangerous, your very memory. But if you undo it, of course, then you can get caught in a little circuit loop where you keep replaying it over and over again, which is just as dangerous because you never get anywhere. It's the Fermi paradox or whatever. But
You can make a note. You can make a note.
Yeah. Make yourself a note. Do not do this again. And you wonder why. That's so interesting. I will find out. Yeah. No, that's true. But when I imagine something like the scenario where I want to experience jumping into a volcano, not that I necessarily, but maybe I do. Okay, I've thought about this several times. Yeah. I would generally want to be there and be an observer. So it's kind of like telepresence with full sensory, presence.
well, you torture yourself.
When you have complete access to the brain and you can choose which pain to turn off and turn on, those kind of things, it's all pretty optional, So,
My question's about whether uploading could lead to a singularity and whether a save point necessarily, or a backup necessarily confers you safety. Because if you're doing biological experimentation, you can kill one person and there's no way to bring them back. But if you're experimenting with uploaded individuals, maybe you could kill everyone. And I was wondering if you'd thought about that, or whether you had anything more to say about.
could you clarify what you mean by when you experiment with uploads, you could kill everyone? Do you mean killing all of the uploads in the experiment, or do you mean, what do you mean?
If you brought about an intelligence explosion, creating a new intelligence that wanted to monopolize resources in the fashion that Marcus was describing, then perhaps we want to think about when we want uploading to happen, so that we could determine whether the singularity comes sooner or later.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a topic that does get discussed quite a bit, actually. And it gets discussed in multiple ways. It gets discussed in the form of, are uploads safer than AGI? Should we therefore try to get to uploading before AGI, or vice versa? Because uploads, you would think, number one, they might understand our concerns a little bit, although on the other hand, humans don't necessarily always treat other humans really well. So, also, the human brain isn't necessarily built for rapid self-improvement. So whereas you could make an AGI that is just perfectly geared for this constant duplication of how great it is, that's not necessarily the case with the human brain, because you add another layer of cortex, it's not clear that this is going to work. So that kind of improvement may be slower, and it depends directly on things like the hardware that's available and whether it runs faster, which depends on physical resources, etc. There may be ways to contain that you can't do with an AGI. That's not a guarantee. This argument's still going on. It's an ongoing thing, of course. Yeah, I kind of forgot what the second area was that gets looked at, but yeah, that is definitely a concern, because it's not so much a concern for uploaded society as such, because you could make the argument that yes, then you're dealing with a species where this kind of competitiveness is perfectly normal, and they can also borrow from one another. There's a market for new developments, for new kinds of augmentation, sort of like there is here, except it's on a different level. It's kind of more how you improve your own mind, rather than just, how do you get some kind of advantage by having a better car than your neighbor or something like that. But if, for example, there are still populations who choose not to participate in uploading, then you have a lot of the same concerns that you would have with an artificial intelligence there. Same problems you need to deal with. Maybe at a different rate, maybe slightly different somehow, but yeah, I agree.
This relates to a question that's possibly addressed to Marcus himself or both, or it doesn't matter, but relates to the relationship between the singularity and the Fermi paradox, which most people would know about. Where are they? Where are the ETs? Or as Lara Bingle would say, where the bloody hell are they? Which is the famous model here. Anyway, the question is related to what Marcus was saying. The singularity is incommunicado with humans, because that's either too complex for the outsiders, or the insiders, they're just too bored because they're in their virtual Playboy mansion and they're not interested in anything else, right? So therefore, is this a possible explanation for the fact that we don't know, we have no information from singularitarians in perhaps, speculating in other worlds, because we can't see them and they're not interested in us? Or do you think that's where we're heading? And in which case, would people be too thrilled about such a prospect?
Yes.
Happening for us.
No, actually, you want a slightly longer answer? I think that is true. It could be the answer. There are other possibilities, of course. I mean, we could be living inside a virtual reality that some species like that is set up for us, and they don't allow other aliens or something like that. Who knows? So there are many possible explanations, but I think that one could work. Yeah, I agree.
Because the question is both of us. If societies decide to explode inwards, sort of all the planet is converted to computionium, then it looks like noise from the outside, probably. But then there should be societies who are still interested in space travel and its path outwards. And then the question is why it has not arrived at Earth, right? So it explains maybe if you can explain why all species are only inward exploring.
That's contradictory.
Well, up to the point where you get to computionium, and then you need more matter, right? But maybe then it's too late, so then they have changed their goals, or I don't know.
Playboy mansion, all that.
Okay.
I saw a hand up there before. It was a little bit earlier. Did you? Yes? You had a question?
I'd like to go back to the point on immortality. As it seems to me from the reading I've done, the studies that I've done, that the computer power and the computer element of it and artificial intelligence might not necessarily be a component of that. In the Mayo Clinic, they started with the premise that the potential lifespan of the human nervous system is somewhere between 900 and 1,000 years, provided that the nervous system could be properly nourished by efficient organs. And they're making progress towards that. And in surprising ways, they've developed a connection between anti-inflammatory drugs and extension of human lifespan. The produced effects such as the previously and currently, with drugs that are currently legal, treatment of myelofibrosis, which is cancer of the bone marrow, where the bone marrow progressively turns to fibre and death ensues inevitably, progressively. It's a horrible disease. And in their stage 2 trials of CYT387, they have stopped bone marrow cancer in its tracks in 40% of the patients in the trial that were terminally ill from the disease. So progress is being made at a very rapid rate, and they are achieving in there measurable results to extend human lifespan.
We've got limited time to have Randal answer the questions, so I'm just wondering if we could...
But I'm just saying, what do you think of the
distill our comments into questions?
What do you think of the computer elements of immortality along the chemical lines, etc.? Not even involving anything to do with computers.
For many of the other reasons that I mentioned in the slides, I'm personally not incredibly interested in the concept of, you always need quotes for this, immortality in biology, because I don't think it addresses all what I'm actually interested in. But I am certainly not opposed to finding good cures for horrible diseases and things that cause us to deteriorate through whatever we call aging these days. I think it's great that progress is being made there, and I'm sure that more progress will be made. My only point with the chart that I threw up is that there are very many different problems that you have to deal with.
Yeah. And you think they're more important than more complex than the computer ones?
I think the totality of it is more complex than people may imagine when they propose that, oh yeah, life extension is going to be solved because we have a new stem cell treatment. Something like that.
Practical question. Supposing uploading is possible, what about the transition of people moving into that phase? It's not quite the same as just distributing cell phones. Could not the actual process of getting those first volunteers create a panic that could actually destroy the whole system?
Possibly, yeah. I mean, it depends on how you do things, but you can create panics in so many ways. Every time you introduce something new or something comes along that people aren't used to. I'm not sure that that's immediately the sort of thing that I would worry about with these procedures, because it's very likely that that nobody wants to be the first upload, because there are going to be so many problems with that, and it's going to be very slow, and yeah, it's just, like with every trial. I think that hand's been up longer. Not sure about the one in the back. Yeah, you. Yes, you.
I just wanted to ask, you said uploading is a necessary step. What else is on that list?
Oh, well, that becomes a little bit one of those personal things again. I don't know if we can find a lot of commonalities there. Maybe. Jumping into volcanoes? No, not that one. More, for example, the exploration of space or spreading outward. Then augmenting and improving what we can sense and how we integrate knowledge and deal with different mental challenges, basically. So it's not just a matter of uploading, but what do you do when you're there? What can you do with that? So I think there are many ways you can explore that, and it branches out into so many possibilities. I'm very interested in the idea of trying out different kinds of physical experience, as in what kind of input and output you can get from the surroundings that you have, and even with the time, as in what's the rate at which you experience things. It could also be very interesting to see what happens there. So some of this is just exploration, and others is dealing with specific challenges. And I think that there are just such a host of them that we should probably take time, write up a new presentation about this, and gather again and talk about that. Which one was, I saw someone way in the back there.
Over there.
Who is- hasn't-
Over there.
Oh, way back. Yeah, I can't see because there's a light shining right in my face from there, so you're invisible. Yes, okay, you first.
Coming back to Aubrey, I agree, or I share the intuition that immaturity, in a sense, seems to be a necessary prerequisite for novel and unique perspectives in a society. To the extent that I've been able to ask him about it, Aubrey's view on this would seem to be that as long as we maintain cognitive youth for the brain as a biological organ, that brain will generate plastic, novel interpretations of its environment. How would you respond to that? Do you think both those positions are reasonable, or are you skeptical about the second?
I have spoken to Aubrey about this, and he doesn't really disagree with my position because there are two slightly different issues there. The one is, do you have mental health? In other words, are you able to cope with situations that come along, as opposed to basically having Alzheimer's or something like that, versus are you able to take on a perspective that you wouldn't have taken on if let's say there's a perspective that you can't currently take because you already learned a lot about the world. You have a certain representation of how things work, and you're filtering your experiences through that. So it's at a slightly bigger level. It's not that you can't receive the information or that you're not processing it. It's just that you have many filters set up based on your prior experience that you're using to filter that information. So it changes what you're associating stuff with, for instance, and like how you identify things, how you label them.
Do you see uploading as, can that address this issue?
Not immediately. It takes another step. So when we were talking about the different steps, yeah, that's one of those that I want to explore, is how can you solve that problem?
Sure.
So this is a problem of unlearning.
Could call it unlearning, but I don't really want to forget everything I've learned. I want to be able to learn things and still be able to
So like
come up with entirely new ways of processing
There was a
information.
question up there, I think it's been,
Yeah, I just wanted to know, it seems to me we're talking about uploading very much in terms of individual identity and holding on to individual identity. And I'm just wondering, is that a somewhat Western concept, and may an Eastern perspective move possibly in the future towards uploading towards a collective consciousness as distinct to the Jungian collective unconsciousness? Could that take humanity forward where we upload to become one humanity?
Yeah, I agree that it depends on your perspective, whether you're interested in something like uploading individual personalities. Some of the motivations that I mentioned, such as that you are the best champion of a specific way that you would like things to happen, would say that, okay, maybe there are reasons that go beyond just, okay, I want to experience more, which is also valid. But it's true that you could have a different view. It could be that you come from a culture where that doesn't matter as much, and you're more interested in just generating generic humans or something like that. That's possible. Interestingly, I haven't found that this is necessarily the case with Eastern philosophies such as Buddhism, because my main supporter right now actually practices that and sees this approach as an important part in people understanding more about what it means to have an emergent self, and for all of society to be creating something, so that self isn't really something that is fundamentally there, but something that's being generated by all this content of the brain and how it works and how we're all working together to generate some other experience, and that this is something that we should all learn about, and that's why it's important to do these things. And so he's coming at this from a Buddhist perspective. So it's interesting that that was your question there, yeah.
I just wanted to ask about download.
What is that?
We were talking about uploading substrate-free, substrate-independent status, but there may be the possibility of you may wish at one point to download back into your...
It's impossible, because once you're substrate independent, you're substrate independent. If you're going back to a biological form, you're still substrate independent because you just moved substrates again. That's what you're doing. Substrate independent doesn't mean that you don't have a brain that's physical, and it doesn't mean that you don't have a biological brain. You could have a biological. It just means that you have the freedom to choose different ones. If you choose a biological one, great, but it was a choice. That means you're substrate independent. So it's the same thing. And uploading, to me, when I use the term, just means the ability to move this personal identity, this sensation of who you are, all these characteristics from one substrate to another, no matter what type it is.
You would be able to go from.
Yeah. So I just don't have a use for the word downloading, because for me it's the same as uploading. And there's, of course, there's side loading and offloading and all this other stuff, but people use way too many terms for stuff. Yeah. Let's see, is there another? I don't see who's got an arm up. No more questions? Oh, yes, there's one here.
First one, a very quick one. I'm just interested in the poignant possibility that you have this kind of biological original and then your technological emulant uploaded. They're both going to be parallel lives. Well, they're going to bifurcate, aren't they? I mean, how's that relationship going to be with my digital doppelganger? I mean, it strikes me as, well, will I die? Or
if that's what you create,
farewell scene, isn't it?
that's interesting. Yeah, if that's what you create, then that you've got two different people who are, they become more and more different as they experience different things. It doesn't really matter whether that's your biological self and your digital self, or if, let's say, during the process you no longer have a biological self, but then you decide to make 10 digital selves and they all experience different things. It's the same question.
When you do that, or what?
Would you kill yourself? Well, the idea is that if you know what your success criteria are for this project, again, that whole thing comes up, what you call a successful upload, and if you have, let's say, either you think that continuity isn't really a problem, so you can't just slice up brains, so you kill yourself, slice up a brain, make a copy, or you believe that it is a problem, so you need to do in-place replacement of neurons or something like that, or you think that you're a fence sitter like me, and the only safe course, as long as you don't know, is to aim for the one that does assume it's a problem. So you still, again, neuron by neuron replacement. No matter what this process is, you can come up with a version of that procedure where the biological self disappears in the process. You can come up with one where eventually you just have the digital self. But then you could still make parallel cells. There's nothing that stops you from doing that. So you can still experiment with that, that outcome. But then it just becomes a legal question, really. It's like, who owns your property and who's married to your wife? Because really, the rest is just like having different people. It's like twins or something.
My digital me will be smarter than me, and will be condescending and sarcastic words.
Yeah, there are so many possibilities. I mean, I've thought about what would it be like to try to have different cells and then merge them again, if there's some way to do that, or keep them linked, or there's, so many possibilities. So is there any more, or is this the end of the questions for now?
Well, there's one sort of half up over there.
Which one?
Half a question.
Half a
Sorry.
question.
Okay, yes.
Just a question in regarding it to, I guess, jumping to neuron by neuron transmission, assuming it is a problem. But then if you get that substrate independent intelligence, but then you transmit it, isn't that essentially the same as like a destructive upload?
Yes.
Okay.
So then you would have to come up with a procedure for making copies that doesn't involve that separation, if you think it's a problem, if we still haven't figured that out, yeah.
I've got a question. So if people think that it's a good idea, what can people do? I mean, let's talk about the sort of person like me who doesn't have the academic background to contribute to neuroscience. And neuroscientists, what can people generally do?
Well, you're actually doing a lot, I have to say. Thank you very much for organizing all of this here. And I mean that because you don't just need scientists. You need people who can make sure that these ideas get out there as well. You also need people who understand entirely different aspects of what comes into play. So, for example, what is the political landscape? How do you deal with that? We need people in the medical field who can make sure that we can do some kind of, at least trials with maybe small animals or something, I don't know. We need people who understand how to gain resources and put them into a project. And just generally people who go out there and talk to others and talk about these topics. Because there's still, this is a tiny minority that's sitting here, a very tiny minority. The vast majority of the world has absolutely no idea that any of these topics exist. So that's something really important to do.
Also, there's the GF 2045 conference coming up.
Oh, well, okay.
Have you plugged it?
Yeah, I plugged it yesterday, so I can plug it again.
Okay. Did you show? All right, plug it again. And right.
We can't
put on the video.
No, we can't do that because I don't have the video on the laptop unless you have internet access. That's why I asked.
Well, people do. Somebody does.
Okay. Well, if we do, we can put it on. Yeah.
But,
So there's there was a congress back in January in Moscow. Was it February, January? Well, anyway, it was when Moscow's cold, and it was called the Global Future 2045 Congress, and it was attended by a lot of great scientists and also political people and celebrities and God knows all sorts of people showed up. It's very interesting. Now, back then it was somewhat of a local affair. This is being turned into an international ongoing congress and is associated with the Foundation 2045, which is this organization that's interested in providing a support network for development of technologies towards whole brain emulation and also towards body improvements and things like telepresence robots and brain-computer interfaces, which is setting up offices in various places in the world. And the Congress, the next one, is taking place in New York City. It's still, again, it's called the GF 2045 Congress. This is very confusing because most conferences use the year in which they happen, and this one's always 2045.
That's the year when it last happens.
June 15th and 16th, and it's going to be at the Lincoln Center, which is a very beautiful place there, and we already have a host of very interesting people lined up. The main topics are body and brain, but there are also subtopics of society, culture, spiritual, how do we move forward, basically, is the idea. And in the body side, there are going to be some of the people who do fantastic work with human-like robotics. So David Hansen's going to be there, and what's his name, the Japanese guy? I forget his name. Well, it's it's going to be on the website. And yeah, that's right. Yeah, and on the brain side, we've got basically the entire roadmap that I showed with the 4 different quadrants there. All of the people who are representatives of projects in all of those parts are going to be attending. So it should be really wonderful. Please do come. Yeah, I guess that's all.
Well, we've got a break, but what I thought we might do is we're actually finding the video now. So we're going to